My name is Aiden Anderson, and 48 hours ago, my own mother traded my birthright for a lie and called it mercy. They laughed while I was exiled to a ruined farm, never realizing that the palace my brother inherited is a debt-ridden cage, or that I found the double-walled safe containing the tapes of my mother's adultery and the proof that Max isn't even a biological Anderson. I'm not just the youngest son anymore. I'm the forensic ghost coming to collect a debt that blood can't pay. But before I became the storm that leveled their legacy, I was just a silhouette standing in the shadows of a gilded tomb. The air in the law office was thick with the scent of old mahogany and the cold, metallic tang of air conditioning that hummed a little too loudly for a room of such supposed dignity. I stood at the back, near the heavy velvet curtains, feeling less like a morning sun and more like a ghost watching a play I hadn't been invited to perform in. The midday sun struggled to pierce through the overcast Lexington sky, casting long, gray shadows across the polished table where my family sat. My brother, Maximilian, occupied the head of the table. He sat with a calculated posture, radiating that effortless, old-money confidence that seemed to say he owned the oxygen in the room. Next to him was our mother, Marcella. Her face was a mask of reinforced steel, her eyes fixed on the attorney as if I didn't exist. Looking at them, I realized that some people are so poor, all they truly possess is their bank balance. I shifted my weight, my hand instinctively reaching for the worn silver watch in my pocket, the only thing Dad gave me before the end. I used to think Dad's silence was a sign of neglect. Now, standing in the cold vacuum of this room, I began to suspect it was a shield he used to protect me from the very people sitting 10 feet away. "We are here to finalize the estate of Arthur Anderson," Attorney Garrick began, his voice heavy with a professional somberness that felt rehearsed. He started reading the list of assets, and it was a coronation. The Lexington mansion, the thoroughbred horses, the diversified portfolios, everything went to Max. The room seemed to shrink with every word, the walls closing in as the golden sun was draped in the family mantle. Then came my name, Aiden. Garrett cleared his throat, his eyes flicking to me with a momentary flash of pity. "To my youngest, Aiden Anderson. I leave the property in Woodford County, including the farmhouse and all standing structures." Max let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut through the silence like a saw blade. A dilapidated tobacco farm. A ruin. Max stood up, his expensive suit jacket rippling as he reached into his pocket. He didn't walk to me. He slid a rusted, dirt-stained set of keys across the long table. They skidded over the wood, stopping just short of the edge, like a bone thrown to a stray dog. "Dad always knew you liked playing in the dirt, Aiden," Max said, his smirk widening. "Tell you what, I'm feeling generous. I need a stable hand at the estate to muck out the stalls. The pay is decent, certainly better than what you'll make growing weeds in Woodford. I'd hate to see an Anderson starving on the streets." I looked at Marcella, searching for a spark of motherly instinct, a single protest against this public execution of my dignity. She didn't even flinch. She adjusted her pearl necklace and spoke with a chilling, clinical detachment. "It's honest work, Aiden. It suits your temperament more than the boardroom. You were never meant for the pressures of the city." In that moment, the realization hit me harder than the loss of the money. She wasn't just siding with Max, she was trying to bury me. Have you ever been treated like a stranger by your own flesh and blood? It's a silence that screams louder than any insult. I didn't shout. I didn't let my hands tremble. I walked to the table and picked up the rusted keys, the cold iron biting into my palm. I remembered something Dad once told me. Forgiveness isn't for the weak. It's for the strong enough to realize that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I looked Max in the eye, and for the first time, he was the one who looked away. "I accept my father's wishes," I said, my voice steady and resonant. "Not because I need the land, but because I respect his word more than you respect your own blood. A man who builds his own house is more secure than a man who inherits a palace he doesn't know how to clean." I turned to leave, the silence in the room now heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. "I'll take the ruins, Max," I added over my shoulder. "At least the foundations are real. You might find that gold is a very poor insulator when the winter actually hits." I walked out of that high-rise, the Lexington skyline feeling like a cage I had finally escaped. The hardest part of moving forward isn't the walking. It's the decision not to look back at the people who never intended to follow you. I had exactly $500 in my checking account and a truck that groaned every time I hit the gas. But as I pulled out of the parking garage, I felt a strange, terrifying clarity. I drove toward Woodford County as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the Kentucky hills swallowing the road in a blanket of thick, rolling fog. I thought of my father, Arthur. He was a man of few words, but he was a master of the long game. I could almost hear his voice in the hum of the tires. I didn't realize it then, but he hadn't left me the farm to punish me. He left it because only a heart that has been emptied can truly be filled with the truth. I whispered into the quiet of the cab, "I see the trap you set for them, Dad, and I'm starting to see the map you left for me." As I pulled up to the overgrown, sagging gates of the farm, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from Vesper, my wife. I pulled over, the engine idling roughly. "Don't bother coming home," it read. "Max told me everything. I'm moving my things to the estate tonight. I can't be tied to a loser." I stared at the screen, my knuckles whitening against the steering wheel. I didn't cry. The betrayal was so complete it felt like a physical numbing agent. I turned off the engine and looked at the dark silhouette of the farmhouse. Just then, I saw it. A single, faint light flickering in the cellar window, as if the house itself was breathing. The flickering light in the cellar was the only thing that kept the darkness from swallowing me whole. I stepped over the threshold of the Woodford farmhouse, and the floorboards let out a low, agonizing groan, as if the very wood was mourning my arrival. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of wet wool and decades of settled dust. I moved toward the fireplace, finding a cracked photo of my father sitting on the soot-covered mantel. Despite the spiderweb of fractures across the glass, Arthur's eyes remained steady, anchoring me to a world that was rapidly dissolving. I whispered to the empty room, "You always said a man isn't defined by what he has, but by what he can survive." I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. I walked to the kitchen and tried the faucet, but it only emitted a dry, rhythmic rasping sound, the death rattle of old pipes. There was no heat, the windows were rattling in the freezing Kentucky rain, and my phone displayed a mocking 4% battery. It's funny how luxury acts as a mask that hides our true nature, but poverty is the mirror that finally reveals it. I felt the bite of the cold, but I refused to let it break me. I remembered a winter years ago when Dad gave our last $10 to a hitchhiker at a truck stop. I had asked him why, and he simply said, "Because his desperation is louder than our hunger." I decided then that I wouldn't hate Max or Marcella for their greed. I would pity them for the hollow emptiness they were trying so hard to fill. The silence was shattered by the roar of an engine. Powerful headlights cut through the sleet outside, sweeping across the peeling wallpaper like a searchlight. I knew the silhouette of that SUV. For a brief, foolish second, I hoped Vesper was there to tell me the text was a mistake, that she was standing by me. But the way she slammed the door, a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the hills, told a different story. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. Vesper stepped into the ruins, her designer heels clicking against the rotting wood like the ticking of a countdown clock. She didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. Instead, she reached into her leather bag and pulled out a thick white envelope. She tossed it onto the kitchen table, the paper sliding through the dust. It was a petition for the dissolution of marriage and a temporary restraining order. She had worked fast, ensuring I was legally severed from everything we had built together before I could even catch my breath. "Aiden, this place is a tomb," she sneered, her eyes scanning the ceiling as if she was afraid the mold might stain her reputation. "And I refuse to be buried with you." She stepped closer, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she delivered the final blow. She didn't just want a divorce, she wanted to erase my existence. Vesper confessed that she had been seeing Max for months, and then she leaned in to whisper that she was carrying his child. She called me biologically irrelevant, a dead end in a family of titans. It was a calculated strike, designed to tear the last shred of dignity from my bones. I felt the air leave my lungs, a heavy compression in my chest that made it hard to stand. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole heart? The pain is so sharp it becomes cold. I looked at her, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw her clearly. I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. A woman who leaves a sinking ship for a shiny one deserves the wreck she eventually finds, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. You didn't marry a man, Vesper. You married a bank account. I'm just sorry you'll never know the difference. I picked up the pen from the table and signed the acknowledgement of service. My hand didn't tremble. I handed the papers back to her with a silent dignity that seemed to infuriate her more than a scream ever could. I had been erased, but in that erasure, I found the freedom to be someone else. Vesper turned on her heel and marched out, her SUV spitting mud against the porch as she sped back toward the lights of Lexington. I stood in the doorway, watching her taillights vanish into the fog. The strongest people aren't those who show strength in front of us, but those who win battles we know nothing about. I reached into my pocket and felt the weight of Dad's watch. I opened the lid to read the inscription one more time. Justice walks slow, but it always arrives on time. The divorce wasn't the end of my life. It was the final legal separation from the toxicity that had been holding me back. I was finally alone, and for the first time, I was ready to fight. Driven by a strange forensic intuition, I walked back to Dad's old study. I knelt on the floor, my fingers tracing the uneven grain of the oak boards near his desk. I noticed a slight discrepancy, a shadow in the wood that didn't match the rest. I pried at a loose plank, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beneath the dust and a layer of old insulation, I found a heavy iron ring tucked into a recessed hatch. This was the moment where the beggar's son would start to find his own ground. I gripped the ring and pulled. A section of the floor hinged open with a heavy metallic thud, revealing a steep set of stone stairs leading into a cellar that didn't exist on any of the farm's official blueprints. A faint, sharp scent wafted up from the darkness, the unmistakable smell of machine oil and high-grade industrial steel. My knuckles whitened around my flashlight. I realized then that the worthless inheritance I had been mocked for was about to show me its true, cold face. I didn't know what was waiting for me next. The stone stairs were cold, pulling the heat from my boots with every step I took into the belly of the Woodford farm. Cobwebs brushed against my face like ghostly fingers, clinging to my skin as I descended into a silence so absolute it felt heavy. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, eventually hitting a reinforced concrete wall that looked more like a bunker than a farmhouse cellar. It was a room built to withstand the weight of time, or perhaps to guard something that time was never meant to erase. In the center of the small, square room stood a heavy, antique safe finished in a faded forest green. I knelt before it, my breath hitching as I saw the initials AA hand-etched into the steel near the hinge. Even in the middle of a collapsing ruin, my father had maintained a sanctuary of absolute order. Most people spend their lives building facades for the world to admire, but Arthur Anderson had spent his building foundations. I realized then that a man's real legacy isn't what he shows the world in the sunlight, but what he guards in the dark. This worthless farm was starting to feel like a filter, a place designed to keep superficial people like Vesper and Max at a distance. I pulled the rusted key from the law office out of my pocket. It slid into the lock with a mechanical precision that made my skin prickle, but the dial remained, a second layer of defense. I tried my birthday. Nothing. I tried the date he bought this farm. The dial didn't budge. Finally, I thought about the only time he ever truly looked at me with pride. The day he taught me how to balance a complex ledger when I was 10. I spun the dial to that date. Click. The internal tumblers shifted with a heavy, satisfying thud. The iron door creaked open, the sound echoing off the concrete walls like a scream. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting a revelation. Instead, I saw a small, pathetic stack of $10,000 in worn bills and a handwritten note resting on top. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the jagged script. "For your funeral, Aiden. It's all you're worth." The words hit me like a physical blow, a surge of doubt washing over me. Did he truly hate me that much? Was I really just an afterthought in his grand design? Suddenly, the cellar entrance erupted in a blinding flood of white light. I squinted, shielding my eyes as a crew of men with professional cameras and LED panels swarmed down the stairs. "There he is!" a voice shouted. The beggar's son in his natural habitat. Maximilian had sent a local vlogger and a camera crew, under the legal guise of documenting the estate's transition, to capture my lowest moment. They caught me on camera, kneeling in the dirt, clutching a measly stack of cash like it was a life raft. Max's voice crackled through a speakerphone held by the cameraman, his laughter echoing with a distorted, tinny arrogance. "Look at the youngest Anderson, crawling in the mud for 10 grand. Even Dad knew you were a beggar at heart, Aiden. Make sure you get a close-up of that note, boys." The world needs to see what a loser looks like. The vlogger was already typing, the video being uploaded to a live stream that was spreading across Lexington social media like a virus. I could practically feel the collective mockery of the city I had just fled. I didn't turn away. I didn't hide my face or scramble for cover. I remembered a lesson from an old mentor. The lion doesn't turn around when a small dog barks. I stood up, my silhouette tall against the concrete wall, and looked directly into the lens. "Money can be counted," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the shame Max wanted to see. "But dignity is immeasurable. If this is all my father left me, then I will make it enough." I wonder, have you ever been publicly shamed by the people who were supposed to protect you? It's a moment that either breaks you or turns your soul into iron. The crew eventually left, their laughter trailing up the stairs as they hurried to check their view counts. I was left in the ringing silence of the cellar, alone with the safe. I sat on the dirt floor, staring at the green steel box. But the forensic accountant in me couldn't stop calculating. I scanned the physical dimensions of the safe's interior. I measured the depth with my arm. The outer shell was 30 inches deep, but the interior back wall stopped at 24. There were 6 inches of unaccounted space behind that insulting note. I realized then that the $10,000 wasn't a gift. It was the bait. It was a test to see who would stop looking once their ego was bruised. My father wasn't insulting me. He was protecting the content from anyone who lacked the patience or the humility to look deeper. He knew Max would see the money and the insult and walk away satisfied with his own superiority. True value is always hidden behind a layer of something unattractive to keep the greedy away. I reached for a heavy iron pry bar I had found in the house. I slammed the pry bar against the back wall of the safe. Instead of a solid, muffled thud, there was a hollow metallic ring that vibrated through the floorboards. I wedged the tip into the seam and shoved with every ounce of strength I had left. The false steel plate groaned and then popped free, clattering to the floor. My flashlight illuminated a second high-security digital keypad and a leather-bound ledger tucked into the recess. The title on the cover was embossed in gold, "The Truth of the Anderson Bloodline." I sat there, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew the ground Maximilian was standing on was about to turn into quicksand. The false steel plate hit the concrete floor with a heavy, final clang that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. I knelt in the freezing dust of the Woodford cellar, my breath blooming in the air like pale, frantic ghosts. Behind the insult of the first layer sat a climate-controlled compartment, glowing faintly under the yellow beam of my lantern. It held a high-capacity digital drive in a thick, leather-bound folder that looked as though it had been waiting decades for my touch. I ran my fingers over the binding, feeling a sudden, overwhelming respect for my father, Arthur. He wasn't just a man who fixed engines. He was a master strategist who understood the most fundamental rule of survival. The best place to hide a tree is in a forest, and the best place to hide the truth is behind a lie everyone is desperate to believe. I opened the folder, my hand surprisingly steady for a man whose world had just been set on fire. Inside lay the real will, embossed with a seal I recognized instantly. It was notarized by Garrick years ago, long before the staged reading in that wood-paneled office. As a forensic accountant, I've spent my life following paper trails, but this one felt like a roadmap to my own salvation. The document explicitly stated that the Lexington estate was a term-limited trust, granted to Maximilian only under strict ethical and financial conditions. It was a legal cage, and Max, in his arrogance, had already chewed through the bars. Have you ever realized that the person you thought was the villain in your life was actually the only one keeping the ceiling from collapsing on your head? I dug deeper into the compartment, pulling out a secondary file of forensic accounting records. My father had been keeping a second set of books, not to evade the law, but to document the rot. The massive fortune Max was currently flaunting was a poison chalice. It was a bait property, intentionally saddled with millions in hidden, cross-collateralized debts and environmental liens that Dad had been quietly suppressing. Max hadn't inherited a kingdom, he had inherited a bankruptcy waiting to happen. I sat back against the cold concrete, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. I didn't feel joy at Max's impending ruin, only a quiet, profound sadness for the brother who was so eager to sit on a throne that he never checked to see if it was placed over a trap door. Looking back now, I should have seen that Dad's neglect was actually his way of keeping me clean from the filth they were drowning in. The air in the cellar grew colder, the scent of damp earth mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of the hidden safe. My flashlight beam caught a small silver microcassette recorder tucked at the very bottom of the compartment. It was labeled in Dad's precise, slanted handwriting, "The Price of Silence." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. I knew once I pressed it, the version of the mother I had tried so hard to love would be gone forever. I pressed play. The tape hissed for a few seconds, a scratching sound that felt like nails on a chalkboard, and then her voice filled the small space. Marcella's voice, 40 years younger, but carrying that same razor-edged coldness that had defined my childhood. She wasn't talking to Arthur. She was arguing with a man whose voice sounded like gravel, a man I vaguely remembered from old family photos, Arthur's greatest business rival. The tape was a jagged window into a nightmare. Marcella was confessing that Maximilian was not Arthur's biological son. He was the result of an affair designed to destroy the Anderson lineage from the inside. I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. The mockery Max had rained down on me, the beggar son labels, the years of Marcella treating me like an intruder in my own home. It was all a projection. I wasn't the failure. I was the only true Anderson heir, and my existence was a constant reminder of her betrayal. "If you don't raise him as your own and give him the Anderson name," Marcella's voice hissed through the speaker, "I'll ensure Aiden never sees a dime. I'll make sure the world thinks you are the one who failed this family, Arthur. I'll ruin your name before I let my son be a nobody." I closed my eyes, the tears finally coming, hot and stinging. My father had endured 40 years of a loveless marriage and a mocking son just to protect me. He had allowed himself to be seen as weak so that I could one day be strong. Kindness isn't the absence of power. It is power held in absolute check by love. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have stayed for a child who didn't even know you were fighting for him? I spent the rest of the night in that cellar, the lantern flickering as I cross-referenced the recording with the accounting ledgers. The forensic evidence was absolute. Marcella and Max had already begun siphoning funds from the Lexington Trust to pay off Max's secret gambling debts, a direct violation of the fiduciary terms Dad had set. It was more than a mistake. It was a criminal breach that automatically triggered the transfer of all remaining assets to the secondary heir, me, Aiden Anderson. The beggar son was now the legal owner of every brick and blade of grass Maximilian called his own. I didn't realize it then, but the truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it isn't going anywhere. I pulled out my phone and looked at the beggar son video. It had 3 million views. The comments were a cesspool of people laughing at the man kneeling in the dirt. I felt a strange, detached pity for them. They were laughing at a man who was, at that very moment, holding the keys to the kingdom. I prepared a digital file and sent an encrypted message to Attorney Garrick. I knew he had been waiting for this signal for decades. I didn't need to attack them. I just needed to stop shielding them from the consequences of their own choices. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply step out of the way and let the person running at you trip over their own shadow. The sun began to bleed over the Woodford Hills, casting long orange streaks of light across the porch as I climbed out of the cellar. I stood there, the cool morning air filling my lungs, watching the gravel road. A cloud of dust appeared in the distance. 2 vehicles, Maximilian's silver SUV and a local sheriff's cruiser. My knuckles whitened around the leather folder, but my heart was steady. I watched them approach, Max's face visible through the windshield, twisted into a triumphant, ugly grin. He was coming to serve the final eviction notice, to kick the loser off the land. He thought he was coming to finish me off. Max jumped out of the car before it even fully stopped, waving a legal document in the air like a trophy. The sheriff followed him, looking uncomfortable, his hand resting on his belt. "Time's up, Aiden," Max shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet valley. "The court signed it. You've got 1 hour to pack your rags and get off my property." I didn't move. I didn't argue. I just stood on the porch of the house he called a ruin, looking down at the brother who wasn't a brother. I realized that the hardest part of moving forward wasn't the walking. It was the realization that the people who tried to bury you didn't know you were a seed. I saw the sheriff's eyes move to the folder in my hand, and I knew the paper he was carrying was about to become a relic of a dead era. Maximilian stood on the gravel driveway of the Woodford farm, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant malice as he waved the eviction notice. The sheriff beside him shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Max's laughter was a jagged sound that tore through the morning quiet. He expected me to beg, to crumble, or to offer some desperate plea for more time. Instead, I reached into the leather folder and handed a single, notarized sheet of paper to the sheriff. "This is the real will, along with a court-ordered stay of execution on any property transfers," I said, my voice as calm as the hills behind me. The sheriff's eyes widened as he scanned the document, then he turned to Max with a frown. Max's smirk died instantly, replaced by a confused, stuttering rage. He didn't stay to argue. He scrambled back into his SUV, shouting that he'd see me in hell, before racing off to prepare for his success gala. I watched the dust settle, knowing that a house built on lies cannot stand a storm of facts. 3 hours later, I arrived at the Lexington estate. I wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a mask of forced politeness. I was still in my work clothes, the dust of Woodford still clinging to my boots, a man who finally knew the value of the dirt beneath his feet. As I walked through the grand mahogany doors, the glittering chandeliers seemed to dim under the weight of my presence. The high society guests, the same ones who had spent the afternoon sharing the Beggar Son video, froze mid-sip. Their whispers followed me like a cold draft. Looking back now, I should have seen that their judgment was just a reflection of their own fear. I thought of a truth I once heard. The truth doesn't cost anything, but a lie will eventually bankrupt you. I moved through the crowd, feeling a deep, hollow pity for these people who believed that gold leaf could hide the smell of rot. Near the catering station, an elderly maid was struggling with a heavy silver tray, her hands trembling under the weight of crystal flutes. I stepped forward and took the edge of the tray, steadying it for her, ignoring the disgusted sneers from a group of debutantes nearby. I leaned in and whispered to her, "Don't let them make you feel small. Kindness is the only currency that doesn't lose value when the market crashes." She looked at me with a spark of genuine gratitude that was worth more than every diamond in that ballroom. The music was a swelling, arrogant orchestral piece, designed to make Maximilian feel like a king. He stood on the grand marble staircase, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand, ready to deliver his victory speech. But before he could utter a word, the heavy front doors swung open again. This time, it wasn't a guest. It was a group of suit-clad men from the federal marshal's office, led by Attorney Garrick. The room went silent as they marched toward the staircase. Max's face turned a sickly shade of gray. I stepped forward into the light of the central chandelier, the folder from the safe tucked under my arm. I had already filed the notice of default and a formal claim for breach of fiduciary duty. Because the real will and the hidden debt files proved Max had been illegally siphoning funds to cover his gambling debts, the bank had moved with lethal American efficiency. The success gala was officially over. The marshals began placing bright orange, seized stickers on the 18th century art and the grand piano. Max lunged at me, his face contorted, his voice a frantic scream. "You're stealing my inheritance. This is my house." I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, my voice steady and resonant enough to carry to the back of the room. "You didn't inherit a fortune, Max. You inherited a debt to the truth, and today the bill is due. I didn't do this to take your money. I did it because our father's name deserves to be more than just a signature on a fraudulent loan." Marcella rushed through the crowd, her expensive silk gown rustling like a snake in the grass. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her voice shrill with desperation. "Aiden, you are a disgrace. You are nothing but the illegitimate son of a common mechanic, trying to tear down a legacy you don't understand." I felt a flash of sorrow for her, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, surgical resolve. I pulled out the certified DNA report and the silver microcassette recorder from the safe. I walked to the DJ booth, plugged the device into the house's sound system, and hit play. Marcella's own voice, 40 years younger and dripping with malice, filled every corner of the ballroom. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence as the elite of Kentucky heard her confess that Maximilian was the son of Dad's greatest enemy. The recording was a jagged blade that sliced through decades of deception. I handed the DNA results to Max, whose hands were shaking so violently he dropped his glass, the crystal shattering on the marble. He looked at the paper with eyes that had lost all their light. I looked at both of them, feeling the weight of the outsider label finally falling off my shoulders. "You've spent 40 years calling me the intruder, Marcella," I said. "But it turns out I'm the only one in this room who actually belongs to the Anderson family." Marcella, backed into a corner, didn't crumble. Instead, she regained her composure with a terrifying, sociopathic coldness. She stepped into my space, her perfume cloying and sweet. "You think a piece of paper makes you a winner, Aiden?" she whispered, her voice a low, lethal hiss. "You stole those files from a private safe. I'll have you in a cell for grand larceny and trespassing before the sun rises." She signaled to her high-priced private security team, and 4 large men in black suits began to surround me, their hands moving toward their belts. The guests scrambled back, sensing the shift from a legal drama to a violent confrontation. I didn't look at the guards. I didn't look afraid. I looked past them to the foyer, where Attorney Garrick was entering with a man in a dark trench coat holding a federal badge. I looked back at my mother, a woman who had tried to erase me before I was even born. "A cornered animal always tries to bite, Marcella," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "But you forget, that recording wasn't just about your affair. It was about the financial crime you committed with Max's biological father to systematically drain Arthur's accounts while he was dying. That's not a family matter anymore. That's a federal indictment." As the guards hesitated, seeing the badge at the door, I realized I hadn't just found a farm. I had found my voice. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but the handcuffs were already being polished. I pulled into the gravel drive of the Woodford farm, the engine of my old truck ticking in the heavy, humid silence of the evening. Following the chaos at the gala, the world felt like it was tilting on its axis. I retreated here, to this skeletal farmhouse, knowing that a cornered predator doesn't just run, it strikes back with a ferocity born of total loss. I sat on the porch, watching the fog roll over the Kentucky hills, and I thought about something Dad once told me. A man who has lost his reputation will often burn the world down just to hide the ashes. I didn't realize it then, but I was sitting in the epicenter of someone else's desperate fire. The night deepened, and I chose to stay in the shadows of the porch without a single lamp lit. I saw them before they saw me, a single pair of headlights cutting through the mist, moving too fast for the narrow road. I didn't call the police immediately. Perhaps it was a foolish, lingering hope, or maybe just a desire to give them one final chance to choose a different path. I wanted to see if there was a shred of humanity left in the people who shared my name. Sometimes, you have to witness the full extent of a person's darkness before you can truly let go. The SUV came to a skidding halt, and Maximilian and Marcella stepped out. Even from 20 yards away, I could smell the contrast. Expensive French perfume mixed with the sharp, suffocating stench of cheap gasoline. Their faces were distorted, stripped of the high society masks I had known my entire life. They looked like strangers, hollowed out by a desperate madness that left no room for reason. I looked at them and felt a cold, sharp wisdom settle in my chest. You can't save someone who is more in love with their lies than they are with the truth. I realized then that their old money was never a shield. It was just a blindfold that led them straight to this cliff. Without saying a word, Max began to move with a frantic, manic energy. He started splashing accelerant onto the dry porch boards and the house siding, his eyes wide and glassy. Marcella stood back by the car, clutching her pearls with one hand and a lighter in the other, a silent, frozen accomplice to the attempted murder of her youngest son. They weren't just trying to burn a house, they were trying to erase the evidence, the DNA, and me along with it. Max struck a match, and the darkness erupted. The dry wood of the porch caught instantly, a cinematic wall of orange flame roaring toward the rafters. They stood there, bathed in the heat, believing they were finally free of the beggar son and the real Will. But they didn't know the man I had become. Using the tactical patience I had learned from my father, I had already moved the original documents to a fireproof vault and activated the thermal suppression system I'd spent the last 48 hours installing. I stepped through the smoke, emerging onto the unburned section of the porch like a ghost of the man they had betrayed. I didn't feel terror, I felt a profound, weary pity. "Fire doesn't just destroy, Max," I said, my voice cutting through the crackle of the flames. "It purifies. You think you're burning my future, but you're only illuminating the ugliness of your own hearts." Max froze, the gasoline can slipping from his hand as the fire reflected in his terrified eyes. I reached out a hand, offering to pull him away from the spreading heat, a final gesture of langue d'ote that went beyond logic. But Max didn't take it. He backed away, shouting a string of curses that were drowned out by the sudden, rhythmic wail of sirens. As the flames licked the rafters, the blue and red lights of the Woodford Sheriff's Department and federal investigators flooded the yard. I hadn't orchestrated this as a trap for revenge. I had orchestrated it as a witness. I wanted the law to see what they chose when they were given a final out. The legal arrest was swift and clinical. Max and Marcella were tackled by officers just as the sky finally broke, a heavy Kentucky rain beginning to fall like a deus ex machina to help dampen the fire. Under the weight of U.S. arson and attempted murder statutes, their story was over. As the officers moved Marcella toward the cruiser, her hands bound in steel, I walked toward her one last time. She looked at me with a hatred that was almost breathtaking. I looked back, and for the first time, I felt nothing but peace. "I don't hate you for the fire, Marcella," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I pity you for the coldness that made you light it. The highest form of revenge is to be unlike the person who performed the injury." She didn't respond, her silence a final admission of defeat. I watched the car pull away, the red lights vanishing into the rain. The fire was out, leaving only the acrid smell of charred wood and the damp earth. The smoke lingered in the air, a gray veil over the ruins of my inheritance. Attorney Garrick pulled up to the gate, his face weary but his eyes bright with a strange intensity. He stepped out of his car holding a final, sealed envelope that hadn't been in the safe. He looked at the scorched house, then at me, and sighed. "There's one more thing your father wanted you to have, Aiden," he said, handing me the seal. "Something that explains why he let the fire get this close." I took the envelope, my fingers tracing the wax seal. I looked at the farm, at the charred porch, and then at the vast, dark hills beyond. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I felt a sudden, sharp intuition. The worthless farm held a secret beneath the soil that was about to change the history of this land forever. I stood in the rain, no longer a victim, but a man who had finally walked through the fire to find his own name. Looking back now, I realized that the hardest part wasn't surviving the flames, it was deciding what to do with the ashes. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the charred remains of the Woodford porch in hues of bruised purple and gold. I stood amidst the wreckage, the air finally fresh after the storm had washed away the acrid scent of gasoline and betrayal. Attorney Garrick stepped onto the grass, his boots crunching on the wet gravel, and handed me the final sealed envelope. It was a letter dated only days before Arthur's death, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting unmistakably his. I ran my thumb over the wax seal, feeling the weight of a 40-year-old conversation about to conclude. As I broke the seal, my father's voice seemed to echo through the morning mist. He confessed that he had known about Marcella's affair and Maximilian's true parentage for decades. He hadn't stayed because he was weak or blind. He stayed to build a fireproof legal trap that would eventually protect the only person he truly cared for. "Aiden," the letter read, "I had to be the villain in your story so you would learn to be the hero in your own. Only a man who has lost everything knows how to value what truly matters." I touched the paper, the jagged texture of the charred wood beneath my feet, serving as a reminder of the forge I had just survived. His silence wasn't neglect. It was the ultimate, agonizing sacrifice of a man who loved his son enough to let him struggle. I looked out over the hills, a profound sense of healing washing through me. I realized then that a diamond is just a piece of charcoal that handled stress exceptionally well. I wasn't the beggar son or the family failure. I was the forged result of my father's unwavering, silent faith. Every insult from Max and every cold glance from Marcella had been a hammer blow, shaping me into the man who could now stand in the ruins and see a future. I didn't realize it then, but that moment of acceptance was the true inheritance. The final probate hearing in Lexington was a sharp, clinical contrast to the warmth of the farm. In that same wood-paneled office where it all began, the real will was entered into the public record. Because of the documented breach of fiduciary duty and the felony arson charges, Maximilian and Marcella were stripped of every legal standing they once possessed. The Lexington estate, the Gilded Cage, was revealed as a bankrupt shell, a hallowed-out monument to greed that Arthur had intentionally burdened with debt to ensnare the usurpers. Maximilian sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, his arrogance replaced by a frantic, hollow desperation. He leaned across the table, his voice a pathetic whisper, begging me to use the Woodford assets to pay his bail. I looked at the man who had mocked my poverty and called me a beggar. "I spent my life trying to be your brother, Max," I said, my voice devoid of the anger he expected. "You spent yours trying to be my master." Today, we are both finally free of those roles. I chose not to pursue civil damages, not because I was soft, but because revenge is a fire that burns the one who lights it just as much as the victim. I let the law take its course, refusing to add my own bitterness to the weight of their punishment. Marcella sat beside him, the Quiba tip, steel lady, finally shattering. Her name was ruined, her golden son was a convict, and her palace was being sold at auction. I reached into my pocket and gave her a small, sepia-toned photograph of my father from before the lies began. "He loved you in spite of the truth, Marcella," I said, standing up to leave. "That was his strength. My strength is walking away." I left them in that room, two people who had everything and realized they had nothing, while I walked out with nothing and realized I had everything. I returned the deed of the Lexington mansion to the bank that same afternoon. I refused to live in a house built on the foundation of a lie, choosing instead to stay at the Woodford farm. The ruins would be rebuilt, but this time the walls would be honest. I planned to transform the land into a sanctuary, a place for people who, like me, had been discarded or erased by the people who should have loved them. I sat on my porch as the evening light began to fade, holding Dad's old watch. Success isn't about owning the most, it's about needing the least. I have lost a wife who never loved me, an estate that was a trap, and a mother who was a stranger. But I have found my name, my roots, and a peace that no amount of gold leaf could ever buy. I looked toward the horizon, the vast Kentucky landscape stretching out like a promise. I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because I finally understood my worth. And once you know what you're worth, you stop giving people discounts. Looking back now, the fire didn't take anything from me. It just cleared the ground so I could finally see where I was standing. At the end of the day, your value isn't something they can write out of a will or burn in a fire. I've learned that the most powerful thing you can do isn't getting even. It's outgrowing the people who tried to keep you small. I chose peace over pride, and in doing so, I found a wealth that no bank could ever seize. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from a single spark, I want to hear from you. What was the exact moment you realized you were worth more than their lies? Share your journey in the comments. I read every one, and your story might be the light someone else needs to find their way home.